Welcome back. As a reminder to all participants, all sessions are being recorded and live streamed on Facebook. As the world evolves, our military does as well. It is imperative as leaders, we find the bandwidth to accept change, to encourage innovation and development, and also to ensure we are leading with courage and boldness. It is imperative leaders understand the importance of creating an environment where all airmen and guardians have the ability to operate and reach their full potential. This is exactly what the next upcoming session is about. I am excited to introduce Major Megan Biles, who will be moderating the session on leading airmen and guardians boldly. Major Biles, over to you, ma'am.
Welcome back. I have the great honor of moderating our session on leading airmen and guardians boldly. General Brown's Accelerate, Change, or Lose states, we must develop leaders with the appropriate tools to create and sustain an environment in which all airmen can reach their full potential, valuing the many aspects of diversity within our Air Force. Likewise, General Raymond's planning guidance emphasizes the need to value members for the culture they bring with them into the service. He advocates that people of all backgrounds who are inspired by our mission and committed to our standards make the Space Force stronger. In this session, we have the privilege of hearing from some of our top leaders who have been at the forefront of leading inclusively and have been enabling our warfighters to perform and execute the mission to their full potential. I am thrilled to introduce our distinguished panelist, Major General Pamela Lincoln, Mobilization Assistant to the Commander, United States Space Command. General Lincoln assists the commander in shaping the space policy, developing plans, and conducting operations to ensure U.S. joint forces and allied partners are prepared to deter aggression, defend freedom of action, and deliver space combat power in, from, and through the space domain. Our SES, Ms. Glenda Scheiner, Director, Civilian Force Management, United States Air Force. Ms. Scheiner is responsible for force management policies for over 200,000 Air Force civilian personnel. She has a master's degree in public administration and national resource strategy. She won the Presidential Rank Award and has authored 14 professional journal articles. Ms. Scheiner began her career in 1987 as a GS-5 at Robin Air Force Base, Georgia. Our third member is Chief Master Sergeant Gloria Weatherspoon, Senior Enlisted Leader, Defense Equal Opportunity Management Institute, United States Air Force. Chief Weatherspoon serves as the principal advisor to the Commandant and Senior Civilian on policies, curricula, resource issues impacting the professional development and education of 49,000 joint equal opportunity advisors and command climate specialists worldwide, supporting DoD and DHS human relations, diversity and equal opportunity program execution. We truly have a powerhouse team with us, and I can't wait to hear what advice and personal examples you ladies share with us during this session. I will kick it off with our first question. General Raymond charges all space professionals to be bold because our leaders and our nation expect it. In your opinion, what are the bold actions our leaders must take to ensure inclusion for service women? General Lincoln, would you please go first?
Thank you. Thank you, Major Biles, for having me and for all the organizers of this symposium. It's quite an honor to be here. Before we even talk about boldness, it's important to say thank you to all those who came before us, to those who fought for and passed legislation to have men and women in one military, to those who fought to erase the barriers to allow women to go into certain career fields, and to our pathfinders, those who took those first steps so that we could today have the Lori Robinsons, the Mary Ann Millers, the Jacqueline Van Ovos, the Joanne Basses, and so many other wonderful people like my fellow moderators on this panel. Thank you for what you have done. To go boldly, I would think about the three different categories that we use people or bring people into the service. And the first one's recruiting. The second one would be development, and then the third one be retention. And I think to go boldly, we have to start thinking about what demographics are we not touching. For example, there are a lot of people who don't know that you can come into the service up to the age of 39, and legislation has just passed that 55 is no longer the mandatory retirement age, it's 62. So I think we have a group of people that we could be touching. We have internships. We need to start thinking about returnships. People who wore the uniform, maybe took it off for a while, and let's them bring them back into the service. Development, what could we do instead of thinking differently about what we do today with taking a 9 months or 10 months off, having a continuing learning experience throughout the military. So we develop our folks not only to be successful in the uniform, but beyond that, and when they take off the uniform. And then finally, retaining. How do we help people manage their life experiences? So I was just talking to a sergeant who has a special needs baby. And I can't believe I didn't know this, but I discovered that the CDCs will take special needs child if they can take a special needs child only for a couple hours. So this woman, her voice was quavering. She clearly wants to continue serving, but she can't. She doesn't find a path forward for herself in order to manage her life experience. So those are just some examples of how I think that we can continue to march boldly forward to allow women to continue to serve.
Ma'am, thank you for those wonderful examples. I'm going to switch it over to Ms. Scheiner for the same question. What are the bold actions our leaders must take to ensure inclusion for servicewomen?
Well, thank you also for the opportunity to be here. I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to participate on this panel. And so just to piggyback on the remarks that were already made, I'd like to begin by just saying, what does bold action mean to me? And I think boldness means that you're willing to take risk. And that includes asking the tough questions and then being open and receptive to the answers, and then having a willingness to tackle the real issues and make corrective actions a priority. And so as an example of that, within the Department of the Air Force, I believe we recently took some bold action when General Brown, our CSAF, released his Accelerate, Change, or Lose strategy. And that strategy includes 4 action orders. And action order A is related to airmen, and it has 3 lines of effort. And one of those lines of effort is to champion a culture of support and inclusion for all airmen and families. And that line of effort, if you look into it, it's further described as diversity and inclusion fully ingrained throughout the force. And so there are various initiatives that are ongoing to support the lines of effort, but laying out that vision is only a part of bold leadership. You also have to have the commitment and the willingness and the courage to hold yourself and your team accountable to the inclusion objectives. The Accelerate, Change, or Lose strategy has airmen currently at all levels actively engaged on initiatives to support the strategy and to report out on the progress on an ongoing basis. Also, a few years ago, the Air Force established the Department of the Air Force Barrier Analysis Working Group. And that group has done extensive research in the areas of barriers in advancement for women, and they brought forward many initiatives that ended up getting incorporated into Air Force policies and programs. And the Air Force is also supportive currently of the Women's Initiative Team, who's helping to support this great event, the WIT. And this is a group of women working at the grassroots level to tackle initiatives that are important to women. And the Air Force leadership is committed to listening to the ideas that they bring forward and having a willingness to make changes. So a great example is the WIT team recently gathered data from thousands of women across the Air Force about health concerns that were caused by the previous hair standards for our active duty military members. And they brought it forward to the Air Force Uniform Board, and ultimately they impacted a change to the Air Force regulation on hair. So these are some, I think, some bold examples of boldness, but sometimes bold actions do not have to be grand. They can be done at the individual level. And I believe that leaders can be influential and they can exhibit boldness simply by leading through their example, ensuring equal opportunity in their hiring actions, providing inclusive leadership development opportunities that are based on merit rather than other factors are 2 simple ways that leaders can promote inclusivity. Staff members need to see evidence in our organizations of inclusiveness when individuals are selected to advance or to get further development. And then finally, I think that as leaders, we all need to honestly self-assess and ensure inclusivity and pay close attention to the results of things such as the diversity and the inclusion aspects of surveys in our organization, such as our federal employee viewpoint results, which have been recently made available. We can look at those results and learn where we need to further improve within our own organization. And finally, the last thing I would say is that leaders could also take a bold move by being willing to do an unconscious bias assessment to determine if maybe they have some blind spots that they're not even aware of. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for that. I want to circle back to what you opened with, because I think that those are good points for all of us listening in, as you simplified into 3 awesome steps of ask first, be open and receptive, then take action. And just highlighting it doesn't have to be grand, and the steps that you can take matter so much for maybe just 1 or 2 individuals, but it also can have a rippling effect that it could impact the entire service. So thank you for that. Now, Chief Weatherspoon, what further advice would you give on being bold?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. So before I start, I just want to say that I am extremely proud of our Air Force being able to have the opportunity to work with individuals from other joint services. If I will pat my brothers and sisters in arms in the Air Force on the back to say we are leaps and bounds with regard to putting policies and programs in place that are considerate of women in general. The hair policy, for example, I got to listen a little bit earlier while we were talking about the differences between the pregnancy policy and PME between our services and other services. So I will say I am proud of the Air Force as a whole for some of the things that we've done. My perspective when I think about leading boldly, I think what came to mind was more so the individual. And so to lead boldly as an individual, I think it's important to be vocal. And one of the hardest things that I found in my experience and then sharing experiences for others is for an individual to advocate for themselves, to speak up when they are not getting what they need to thrive. And oftentimes, while we place these on the shoulders of the individuals in our most highest leadership position, it really, we forget sometimes that we actually have a lot of power at the lowest levels possible. And so we have to be vocal about problematic behaviors that we're seeing in our organizations. We have to speak up to ensure that we are being treated the way we ought to be. And those things are a little hard to do, I understand. And so my second one is for an individual to own your power, to understand that you've gone through the training, you've been through basic and PME and all these other things, and you wear this uniform just like the person standing to the left or the right of you. So to be confident in what you are doing and understanding you are in that place because you are ready to be that leader and take that leadership position and do the things to take care of all of your airmen. And let go of fear and apprehension and do what you know you were trained to do and what you are sometimes inclined to do by your character. So to let go of the apprehension of, you know, maybe somebody won't like this idea, or maybe somebody else will come up with it, and just go for it and use the tools that we have in place to push your ideas up farther so we can have those barrier breaking policies in place. And my last one is determination. If you want an environment that is positive and the environment you are not in is positive, be as determined to put those things in place instead of waiting for others to do it for you. The time is so right for those ideas to manifest into changing into the culture that we want and we all deserve. So be vocal, own your power, let go of fear and apprehension, and determination, BOLD. Bold.
Thank you. I love that. And I love that you say that the time is right, because we've seen so many fantastic changes right now making its way through the wicket. So I 100% agree with that statement. If there was any time to be bold and promote change, it's now. So thank you all for that wonderful advice. For our next question, we're eager to hear about your own personal experiences and examples of leading boldly. I'll start with Ms. Scheiner. What does leading boldly mean to you? And can you share a personal example of what you've witnessed or when you've exemplified bold leadership?
Sure. Leading boldly, I think, involves the courage and the willingness to take risk, as I mentioned before. And I think leaders at all levels can exhibit bold leadership. But as a member of the senior executive service, I certainly have a great opportunity and also a responsibility, I believe, to boldly lead and influence change both personally and professionally. And so, as I mentioned earlier, leaders need to be willing to ask the hard questions and conduct independent assessments on where they need to improve, and then take action on the results. So I'm going to start with something done at the organizational level and then fold into how I'm having the opportunity to participate in that. So as an example, last summer, in light of the racial protest in the nation, the Air Force was bold when it asked the DoD Inspector General to conduct an independent racial disparity review within the Air Force. And we didn't have to ask for that review. No one demanded that we go out and ask for this independent review, but bold leadership demands that you ask tough questions and get unbiased assessments. And so they did ask for this independent review, and that RDR focused mainly on racial disparities within the Black and African American community. However, it did identify disparities in other races and ethnicities, as well as with gender. And so the review highlighted disparities across a broad spectrum of categories. And so now I'm getting the opportunity to serve as the lead for a working group on one of the findings from that review. And the one that I'm working is racial disparities in the GS-13 to SCS civilian leadership positions. And so while I'm serving as the lead, we've got working group representatives from many stakeholders to ensure that we have diversity of thought as we work the countermeasures to address the issues. And we also expanded the analysis beyond the Black African Americans that was included in the original study to look at the other races and ethnicities, as well as specifically to focus on gender. So in addition to several organizational stakeholders, we also brought in representatives from other groups to include the WIT that I mentioned before. So the Women's Initiative team is participating. The Air Force Diversity and Inclusion Office is on my working group, as well as a rep from the DAF Barrier Analysis Working Group. And so that's one example. And meanwhile, the DAF has now requested that the DoD-IG move out on a second racial disparity review and to specifically review gender as well as the other race and ethnicities. And that review will likely be out in about 6 months or so later this summer. I think another example of bold leadership is when the Air Force in the past has requested independent studies in the area of gender and minorities. So in my role leading this disparities working group, we're heavily leveraging a previous RAND study that the Air Force sponsored on barriers to advancement and retention in women and minorities. And so the work of Air Disparities Working Group, as well as all the other lines of effort, are due to be complete this summer, but it's just a starting point since that new RDR on gender and the other races will be released around the same time, and then we'll start working those actions. And then finally, one last personal experience. I think that leaders can influence from both their positions as well as personally. And so on a personal level, one thing that I chose to do was that I served for over 5 years as the president of an organization called the DoD Senior Professional Women's Association, or SPWA. And that organization, located in the National Capital Region, is open to senior civilians, officer, enlisted, and contractors. And its aim is to promote the professional development of women. And like the WIT within the Air Force, this organization is important, and it serves as a really invaluable resource for women to further development and to expand and enhance their professional network. The RAND study that I alluded to a minute ago identified that one factor that's perceived as important for advancement is professional social networks. And so an organization such as this is a great conduit for that to happen. And so those are just a couple of examples of how I've been involved both personally and professionally.
Thank you, ma'am, for those wonderful examples. Chief Weatherspoon, what would you give as personal examples where you've witnessed or exemplified bold leadership?
So I will say, so I'm going to tell this story, but the names will be omitted to protect the innocent. So we had a situation. So I want to point out that sometimes people don't realize that in the support world, a lot of the things we do affect the entire installation. And there was an instance at Base X where there was a decision that was being made to open up a facility that caused a health and safety hazard. And so it took, not literally standing on desks, but it took just kind of digging in and standing firm on the decision not to do that and the effects that it would have. It caused, you had to quickly gather data and grab experts to kind of make sure that this decision didn't happen. And although this leader really wanted this decision to happen, it was not good for our team in the unit, and it was not good for the installation as a whole. We ended up, the right decision ended up being made. I don't want to say it, it was a win. The right decision ended up being made. Took a couple shots to the chest for that one, but it was absolutely warranted. And I think sometimes being a bold leader means you have to make sure you put your suit of armor on and you take those shots for your team and make sure that they are protected and covered and that their voice is heard. And when they are right, you stand firm in that right and you trust them to do the right thing. They absolutely did. And we ended up solving the issue without having any safety or health issues. So that was a big one. That might have been my first big challenge as a chief.
Thanks for that, Chief. And I like that you highlight sometimes being a leader means that you are taking it for those that are beneath you. You're the one who's covering it, and you're the one who's ultimately supporting them. And that accompanies the boldness that's required to make some of those changes. And sometimes you have to bear that alone, or it can seem very hard. So I appreciate that story. General Lincoln, can you please provide a personal example of boldness that you've seen or exemplified?
Absolutely. So, boldness is really doing the right thing without having to be told to do it, waiting for permission to do it, or sometimes doing something that is extremely unpopular. And so at the very beginning of my career, women were first joining the ICBM career field, and it was very unpopular with the crew force. But I had a fantastic squadron commander and a Colonel Tom Dubois and wing commander Colonel Birchfield who made it happen and treated all of us with equality. And the important thing is when you want to be inclusive, you have to provide opportunity, right? People have to see that there are opportunities, and both those gentlemen ensured that the women were going to be treated fairly and with opportunity. Example would be, there's a lot of excitement, like, change and this is great, but people don't realize that there was a lot of patience and a lot of years behind that to make changes. And for example, the hair standards. I supported Air Force A1 back in 2014, and there were several people who are trying to make change, but sometimes the time's not right. And so you have to fertilize the ground to make sure that when the time is right, the change does happen. So I give kudos to all those folks in A1 that were trying to do the good thing, the right thing. And then finally, as an example, you have to have someone who's bold enough to ask the question, and you have to have someone who's bold enough to say yes. So for example, our former Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Wilson, when he was the Global Strike Commander, he took the sword and the shield and he ran up the hill on daycare hours because CDC hours were not conducive to folks who had to work 12-hour shifts. And he said, hey, we need to change how we operate the CDC. And folks who manage that program with, good-hearted Americans who want to do the right thing, they said, this is going to cost us money, and this is going to be hard, and this is just not worth the squeeze. But General Cox, who was the A1, said, but it's the right thing to do. So he and other folks made it happen. So asking the question and saying yes. And those are my examples.
Well, ma'am, that's a perfect segue into our next question. So asking and saying yes I'm sure the symposium is inspiring all of us to want to lead boldly and inspire change. But my next question to you, is drawing on how do you empower those beneath you to actually be able to say yes? How do we get the position from ask the question to the right person who can say yes? And how do you make it through the entire wicket? As we saw earlier with Aaliyah, you have to take it all the way up to the policy owner who actually holds the position, but there's a lot of steps all the way up for doing that. So Chief Master Sergeant Weatherspoon, will you lead us off on this question?
So for me, I think how the steps you take to empower others in the organization to lead boldly is you have to, Major General Lincoln said, fertilize the space. You have to create an environment where they feel comfortable even coming to you with an idea or problem. I know oftentimes you may have situations where you have leaders, when someone comes to them with a concern, we tag it with the word complaining. I don't like the word complaint at all. So when somebody comes to you with a concern, I think as a leader, you do the due diligence to sit down with that individual and say, okay, so this is your concern. If you were in charge for a day, what do you think we should do to solve it? And you may find that they have a rational, reasonable solution to the problem. And so as a leader, then you help them through the process that Major Nadine was talking about earlier. This is how you make change. Are you ready? Do you have other people who think like and listen and be ready for change and not go into with our own experiences on the table so we don't get to hear what our folks are saying. So that's what I think that we can do to empower our folks, to make them feel like what they're saying is valued.
Thank you, Chief, on speaking about culturing and empowering. I'd like to hand it over to General Lincoln on what advice you would give on how to empower those beneath you as well.
Chief, what you said was awesome. I don't know if I can improve on that or add to that, but you know, as a leader, you have to go out and talk to your folks. If you want them to be able to talk to you, they have to see you and see you as being accessible. So, you know, when you go out and see your folks, you see where they live, you see their environment, you see everything that they have to deal with. You learn their stories. Remember, that was General Goldfein's push, is know their stories. And when you know them and they feel that you do know them, they will come to you with their concerns. As General Colin Powell said, when people stop bringing their, well, he said problems to you, that's when they've lost trust in you. And the one other thing I would add is make sure that people have a seat at the table, physically and literally, right? Because when you have a seat at the table, that means you also have equal say. And too many times I've had to tell people, hey, you need to get up to the table because you belong on this team. Don't sit on the sidelines, come to the table.
Thank you, ma'am. Ms. Scheiner, what would you say about empowering others?
Well, I'd like to begin by sharing a story from my very first position in the Pentagon. When I came to the Pentagon, I was a GS-15. This is back in 2005. And my supervisor at that time was a Tier 2 SES. And his basic leadership philosophy was be bold. And I can remember so many times taking an idea to him to get a vector, and his response was, be bold. And so I knew that I was empowered to go out and take risks and try new things. But I also knew with that empowerment, I would be held accountable for my actions. And so I think I learned from his philosophy, and my own personal leadership philosophy that I share with my team is called Be the Best. And each letter of that stands for something that I value. Now, I think the seminar has motivated me to explicitly change one of the B's to be bold. Right now, it's not explicitly in there, but it's incorporated in my leadership philosophy in two of the things that are written in there. And one of them is, one of the E stands for envision the future. And one of the B's currently is be innovative. And so when I talk to my team and we talk about my leadership philosophy, you know, I tell them the importance of looking to the future and finding innovative ways to do the mission. And that involves being bold and taking risks. And I challenge them to first learn their job. So you need to know what it is that you're trying to do first. But once you learn it, then, you know, you are empowered to go figure out how to do it better and get out of your comfort zone and take some risks. But I also know that in order to have people to take that seriously, they have to know that if they make a mistake, I'm going to have their back. And so as I consider my career at the senior leadership level, I can remember vividly 3 major mistakes in my career. And as I think on those, the interesting thing that is, in general, I don't remember what the mistakes were. You know, they seemed huge at the time, but you move on and they don't seem that huge anymore. But what I do remember is the feeling in the pit of my stomach when I had to go tell that boss, my boss, that we had made a mistake. And in 2 of the cases, I remember that the boss's immediate reaction was to say, hey, mistakes are part of progress. If you're never making a mistake, you're not taking risks, you're not being bold, you're not moving the ball down the field. And then they swiftly moved on to us talking about, you know, what are the next steps in order to correct the issue. And that had a tremendous impact on me. And it really set the example for how I wanted to lead my team. And I think if they had reacted negatively, then I would have had much less of an inclination to lead boldly in the future. Now, you might have caught that I said 2 of the 3 reacted that way, and there were 3 mistakes, right? So let me tell you just a little bit about that 3rd mistake. Again, I was a GS-15 and the leader that I was talking to was a 2-star general. And my team was responsible for preparing and administering a process that he oversaw, although he was not my direct boss. And so the individual who had had that responsibility for years actually retired, and someone new on my team had to take it on. And so for the first time that they led the effort, they actually failed miserably. And for the first time ever in my career, I was called in to the office to say, you guys blew it. You know, you really blew it. And I was really upset because the initial reaction was not, hey, we all make mistakes. The initial reaction was, you're never going to lead this process again. I'm pulling it. It's going to be done by another office. And so I had to accept that that day, and I left. But when I went home, that was on a Friday, luckily, I went home over the weekend and I really reflected on the situation. And what I realized was that that failure was not the failure of a captain and a lieutenant colonel on my team. That failure was mine. I was the one that needed to accept the personal responsibility for that mistake. And I knew my subordinates, they want to do a good job. So if they failed, they didn't have the resources and the training that they needed. So bottom line, we put an action plan in place. We figured out what training they needed. We figured out what resources they needed. And then I had to go back to that 2-star. We could have let it drop. But the lesson here is, what lesson would that have been for my staff to know that we failed? And so now someone else was doing what we should be doing. Instead, we took corrective action. I went back to the 2-star and I said, I know that you said we would never lead this process again, and we did fail miserably. Let me tell you the actions that we've taken. We wanted another shot. And this was a quarterly process. And so in fact, without skipping a process at all, the next quarterly process, we did lead it, just like we had always led that process in the past. But this time we did it with excellence. And I hope that not only did I learn from that mistake, but my staff learned from that mistake on how a leader should respond and take action and take correction and not cast blame, because you'll never get bold move in the future if you do that. But just jump in there and figure out what you have to do to make it correct and give them another chance.
Thank you very much, ma'am. And if I were to summarize what the 3 of you just said on how to empower, I'd say, first off, it starts with culture. And within that, it's talk to them, give them a seat at the table, tell them you want them to be bold, tell them that it's okay to fail, and also empower them to fail. And then when they do, you need to cover them. So I think that's very sound advice that we can all take as leaders as we go forward. We're soon going to go into our live question and answer. And to those attending, please submit your questions on the Facebook chat and they'll be filtered up to our panelists. Before we go into that, I'd like to end this part of the session with you ladies imparting some advice to us all. I know personally, I've always been inspired and encouraged when I see leaders such as yourselves being boldly and standing up and leading in ways that you believe in. But sometimes that can seem daunting or unachievable to those at lower ranks or who are at the beginning of their military career. What advice would you give to airmen and guardians at all echelons on how to lead boldly in their current rank and position? We'll start with General Lincoln.
Well, as we talked about before, it's perseverance. Don't give up. And you heard the previous example of, hey, we went back with corrective actions. So you do own your mistakes, but you just have to continue to push forward. And then from the leadership perspective, like I mentioned before, you have to provide opportunities. Too often, and I've seen this in my career with my peers, too often people take on everything on their own shoulders and they do everything themselves. And if you don't provide opportunities for other people to succeed, then you're not moving forward and you're not thriving as an organization.
Thank you, ma'am. Ms. Scheiner, what would your advice be to enabling people to be bold in all circumstances?
I think being bold requires courage, like I've said before, to respectfully question the status quo, assess risk, and take action. And so I would really challenge individuals at whatever level you lead. First of all, I would dare you to assess your own biases to foster inclusivity. I think it's pretty wonderful that the Air Force just added a fosters inclusion as an Air Force foundational competency. And that competency has been incorporated into the Pathfinder 2021 self-assessment tool in MyVector, which will allow airmen to go out and assess themselves on that competency. Be willing to, do that self-assessment and see where you fall. Dare to empower your team, regardless of what level you lead. Give your team members responsibility and the accountability to take a difference without regard to their gender or their race or ethnicity. And then going back to something that the chief said earlier, dare to drive out fear in your organization. Lead by inspiration, not intimidation. I had a wonderful opportunity in the early 1990s to hear Dr. W. Edwards Deming speak shortly before he passed away when he was in his 90s on his 14 points for total quality management. And the point that really resonated with me was drive out fear. Leaders have to drive out fears that express themselves as bias or prejudice against gender or race. They need to communicate an emphasis on leading boldly, challenging the status quo, being innovative, and then being the example in their organization. Lots of other things I can say, but in the sake of time, I'll leave time for some questions. So I'll stop with that one.
Thank you, ma'am. Chief Weatherspoon, to you, what advice would you give?
Yes, ma'am. So my advice that I would give is because we all start off in different stations. My advice to our most junior airmen, officer and enlisted, is to learn to lead yourself first. The leaders that we want leaders to be kind, take care of us, speak life into us. We have to learn to give those skills to ourselves. We have to learn to do those things for ourselves. So before we can lead others, we have to learn how to lead ourselves first. And when you take all those good attributes because you loved on yourself and you brought yourself up, that becomes a habit. So when you do become responsible for other individuals, you in turn give those things to them. So the best thing you can do, if you lead yourself first, everything else to me will fall into place.
Thank you, ladies. Very well said. And thank you for the amazing discussion. We're now going to go into our live question and answer. The first question I have is, what advice would you give to airmen whose immediate leadership doesn't advocate for them and whose top leadership is not accessible? What should the airmen do to get their concerns heard?
Well, if I could start off, I mean, my first thought is, I hope that person has a fur shirt. Because that first shirt is the connective tissue for the unit. The first shirt is, I mean, their whole role is to take care of the airmen. So I hope this individual has a first shirt, because the first shirt has a direct ear to the commander.
I'd also like to piggyback on that and say that one thing I encourage particularly, well, I think of the civilian side, but across the board is sometimes it's good to bounce something off of a mentor, because it may be that what you're perceiving, once you bounce it off of a mentor, you may get some perspective that you hadn't thought about that might cast a different light on the scenario or the situation. And so never hurts to get that, not in a complaining, someone that you trust, someone that's very confidential, but to have a chance to talk about, this is what I'm perceiving, and to get some feedback on that.
And so I'd like to add to it, and I may, get a phone call or a text later. There is no such thing as your leadership is unacceptable. You can actually reach anybody you want to in the United States Air Force. Now, I don't advocate for just sending General Brown an email out of the blue, right? I'm not saying that, but your leadership is accessible. If your immediate leadership and their immediate leadership is not listening to you, you have commanders, you have chiefs, you have first sergeants, you have group level leadership, you have wing level leadership. So you have access to those individuals. I'm gonna piggyback off of what Ms. Scheiner said too. Go to a mentor. If you have a chief that's not in your unit that you're close to, go to that chief. And I would say for that chief, have a conversation with that unit chief, because one of the things, we are very territorial when it comes to our airmen. If an airman comes to me with an issue, I am going to track down that chief and let that chief know. What I have found is 9 times out of 10, the chief was unaware of the issue at all whatsoever. So I would say there is no such thing as inaccessible leadership, because everybody has email. And I'm probably going to, maybe I get phone calls later, I don't know. But that's the truth. Your leadership is accessible.
Thank you, ladies. I also want to do a plug while we're in the symposium is the barriers analysis working groups, especially with the WET, is we're a very good resources. Some of those questions, especially hair policy and many others that have filtered up, is you might not know the right way to bring it up to address it and who the policy owner is. And sometimes up through your echelon of your chain of command, that could actually be the issue as well. So use these barrier analysis groups too, because I know that they want to partner with you. They have ears of senior leaders that are eager to help. And so that's a really good resource for everyone. If you have something that you feel you've been bubbling up and it's just not getting up the correct way, please reach out to a BOG and they'll put you in contact with the right folks. Our next question is for Sergeant Sturdivant. During the How to Make Change in Bureaucracy session, it was said that having the passion and confidence to drive change is paramount. What advice can you give in regards to maintaining a level head and holding back the emotion that we often have when we're passionate about a topic?
Never send an email when you're angry. And in fact, maybe don't even compose it in Outlook, just on the danger that you might send it. Maybe you compose it in a Word document, cool off, maybe go back to it. The saying, cooler heads prevail. And it was mentioned before, mentor, maybe not so much a mentor, but maybe a confidant of, it's good to let off steam. It is good to let off steam because physiologically, it makes you feel better. You're holding all this inside. So having friends, there are other resources. It was mentioned, there's chaplains, there's the EEO office, there's abundance of resources at installations that if you just need someone to talk to, there are people there to listen.
Yeah, and the one thing that I wanted to add was that sometimes, people feel passionate about something and they have a great idea and they want to push it forward. And then ultimately, in some cases, that idea doesn't get put into place, and that can be disheartening. And I've had people say, well, I try to bring forward all these ideas and no one ever listens. But I would say keep floating those good ideas, because it's our responsibility at whatever level we are to come up with those great ideas, to come up with those ways to make things better. But we have to also understand that as things get floated up, sometimes they're going to be implemented, sometimes they're not. That doesn't mean that there's not an appreciation for them. It just means that the senior leaders making a decision have lots of access that maybe I don't have to a lot of different things. And so while I may be very passionate and think this is the way this should be, I don't necessarily have the same access to all the information that the senior leader making the decision does. So I would say continue that passion, continue coming up with good ideas, but understand that they may not always get implemented because of competing priorities or competing factors, but keep on doing the good work of coming up with those ideas.
And so if I could jump on this for 1 second, I learned this, and I love to give credit where credit is due. So I was at the Command Chief training course, and Chief Master Sergeant Kimberly Pollard, she's the NASIC Command Chief now. She said in there, when dealing with your own emotions and reflecting, she does this thing called name it and claim it. So when you feel yourself getting emotional about something, figure out what exactly you feel. Is it frustration? Is it disappointment? Is it anger? Are you sleepy? You know, are there other factors going on with you? So once you figure that part out and you do a little reflection, then you can figure out the why. Okay, so I am frustrated. Why am I frustrated? So I'm a fan of butcher block paper and white poster boards, and I'll write down, I am frustrated about this. Why am I frustrated? What's frustrating me? And that way I kind of work it out in my head, as well as calling my colleagues and just having the discussion with somebody who may see things a lot differently than I do. But the one thing for that internal reflection, name it and claim it. I have used it and that works.
Thank you. We're coming into our last 4 minutes, so I'm going to ask this last question, but also give you the opportunity to give any closing remarks you'd like as we go through it. So as leaders in high-ranking positions, how does bold leadership in the professional sphere blend into your other roles as family and parenting? In your experience, does harmony and family life drive you to advocate boldly for inclusion and tolerance and other issues?
That's a really good question. Yes, the answer is yes. I think my children have taught me patience, and they've taught me to look through the lens of from a different perspective. All three of my kids march to the beat of a different drummer. And I love that. I've learned to really appreciate their perspective, and they've opened up my mind to think at things differently. So I definitely appreciate that. I hope I've answered your question.
All right, so I will say for me, my husband is a retired Master Sergeant. And so I will say the Air Force has given me patience when it comes to my children. So some of the training and the tools that I've learned, I implement those at home. And so when I bring home issues or I tell my husband about a thing, you know, his response is, oh, you gonna let people just get away with that, Chief? Or what you gonna do, Chief? So it helps to live with an individual in the house who has some remembrance of what it was like to serve. He's only been retired 3 years, but you would think it was 30. What it's like to serve. So I get to bounce a lot of things off him, and he kind of reminds me of just, you know, maybe what I've done in the past and how to have challenges. So we've blended the two worlds together nicely, because I get to talk to him and I know that it's not going to go anywhere. And I also know that he's going to give me advice from his maintainer lens. So.
Well, I guess, and I would take probably a little bit of an opposite approach, and that is I don't bring too much of the work discussion home at all. And so it's kind of a, you know, I have the work situation and the colleagues and the mentors, and then home. But of course, my spouse is not from a military background or a government service background, so a little different. But I would say with my girls growing up, and they've both left home now, the youngest one being in college, but I think I learned a lot from them. You know, we live in Northern Virginia, which is a very diverse area. And so they were in public schools and had the opportunity to be exposed to all types of people. And we had some really good discussions a lot of time about diversity from a lot of different perspectives. And so I hope that, you know, we learned from each other. And I think that, you know, they came away with an understanding, I hope, that of the value that everyone brings to the table, whether regardless of their gender or their race or ethnicity, that everyone has something to contribute, and really valuing that contribution based on the merit. in schools, they like to do a lot of team projects. And so my girls really learn to value, they don't care who you are. They don't care what you look like. They just care about whether you do your part and you turn it in on time if they have a team project that depends on you. And I think there's a lot we can learn from that in the workplace.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for such amazing questions. And this concludes our session on leading airmen and guardians boldly. Thank you, Major General Lincoln, Ms. Scheiner, and Chief Master Sergeant Weatherspoon for taking the time to speak with us today. And thank you for the example you've set to us all on leading boldly and sharing your insight on how we can do the same. At this time, I'm going to hand it over to Senior Master Sergeant Johnson. Thank you again, ladies, for the wonderful discussion. It's been a privilege to speak with you.
Thank you so much.